The auctioneer's gavel was already raised when Roscoe Thatcher rode into Harlan's Creek on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and something about the crowd gathered in the dusty square made him pull his horse to a slow, cautious stop before he ever reached the water trough. He had ridden 3 days out of Abilene with nothing but a bedroll, a commission to deliver a letter to the land office, and a general restlessness that had been following him like a shadow for the better part of 2 years. He had not planned to stop long in Harlan's Creek. He had not planned to stop at all, truthfully, except that his horse needed water and his stomach needed something warm. But the crowd caught his attention the way a fire catches the eye in the darkness, not because it was loud, but because there was a quality to it that made the back of his neck prickle. He dismounted slowly, tied his roan to the post outside the feed store, and walked toward the square with his hat pushed back on his head and his thumbs hooked loosely in his belt. The crowd was maybe 40 people deep, shopkeepers and ranchers and women in their weekday bonnets, all gathered in a rough horseshoe shape around the steps of the old Harlan County Bank. On the steps stood 3 men in suits that were a little too fine for a Tuesday morning in a town this size, and beside them stood an older man with a badge on his chest who looked like he would rather have been anywhere else on earth. In the center of the horseshoe, standing alone on the bare dirt as if the space around her had been deliberately cleared, stood a young woman. Roscoe stopped walking when he saw her, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of how she was standing. She had her chin lifted and her shoulders squared, and she was gripping a worn leather satchel with both hands as if letting go of it might be the thing that finally undid her. Her dress was clean but threadbare at the collar, her dark hair pinned up beneath a sun-faded bonnet, and there were shadows under her dark eyes that told a person she had not slept in days. She was not crying. That was the part that got to him most. She was not crying, and he could see from the rigid set of her jaw exactly how much effort that was costing her. He pulled a man at the edge of the crowd by the sleeve. The man turned, irritated, then saw Roscoe's face and thought better of whatever sharp word he had been about to offer. "What is happening here?" Roscoe asked. The man, a barrel-chested fellow with a flour-dusted apron, tilted his head toward the steps. "Bank's auctioning the Pritchard farm. Old Thomas Pritchard died 6 weeks back. Fever took him, left the farm to his daughter, but there was a debt on it, see, and the bank says the debt is due now the old man is gone. They're selling it off today to recover what's owed." Roscoe looked back at the girl. "And that's his daughter, Ruth Pritchard, 22 years old and got nowhere to go. Her mother's been dead since she was a child. No other family in the county that I know of." The man shrugged in the helpless way people shrug when something is wrong but feels too big to stop. "It's all legal, they say. Got the paperwork and everything." The auctioneer, a thin man with a waxed mustache, cleared his throat and held up a sheaf of papers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today on behalf of the First Consolidated Bank of Harlan County to conduct the lawful sale of the Pritchard property, being 140 acres situated on the South Fork of Tanner Creek, including the dwelling house, the barn, the outbuildings, and all improvements thereupon. The opening bid is set at $200, which represents the outstanding balance of the promissory note held by this institution." Ruth Pritchard did not move. She stared at the auctioneer's papers as if she were reading something written there in a language she knew but could not quite believe. Roscoe did not entirely understand what he did next, or why he did it. Later, when he tried to explain it to himself, the best he could come up with was that there was something about the combination of that raised gavel and that girl's white-knuckled grip on her satchel that made it impossible for him to stand still. He was not a man who ordinarily went looking for other people's troubles. He had enough of his own. But he was also not a man who could watch something that was plainly wrong happen in front of him and find no words for it. He walked forward through the crowd. People moved aside without him having to ask them to, something about the deliberate, quiet way he moved making space for him, and he stepped into the open ground in front of the bank steps and looked up at the auctioneer. "Hold on," he said. The auctioneer blinked. The three suited men looked at one another. The man with the badge straightened slightly. "Sir," the auctioneer said, with the particular tone of a man used to managing disruptions, "this is a lawful proceeding conducted under the authority of—" "I heard what it was," Roscoe said. He was not raising his voice. He never had to raise his voice. There was something in the way he spoke, level and unhurried, that carried across open ground without effort. "I want to know something before you bring that hammer down. That note she owes on the property, what is it exactly? A standard land mortgage. And when was it taken out?" The auctioneer looked at one of the suited men, a heavy-set fellow with a watch chain across his middle, who stepped forward with the kind of certainty that came from owning something. "The note was taken out by Thomas Pritchard 3 years ago," the heavy-set man said. "A loan of $200 against the property, payable in full upon demand or upon the death of the signatory. Mr. Pritchard died 6 weeks ago. The note is now due. The bank sent proper notice to the property on 3 separate occasions. Upon demand or upon the death of the signatory," Roscoe repeated. He said it slowly, as if he were turning the words over to look at the underside. "So the bank can call this note at any time they choose." "That is correct. It is standard practice." "It might be practice," Roscoe said. "I am not entirely sure it is standard or fair." He turned to look at the man with the badge. "Sheriff, is there anyone representing the interests of this woman in a legal capacity?" The sheriff, who had the look of a man caught between knowing what was right and knowing who paid for his office, shook his head slowly. "She's got no legal representation that I know of, son." Roscoe turned back to look at the auctioneer. Then he looked at the heavy-set banker. Then he looked at Ruth Pritchard, who had turned her dark eyes to him for the first time. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something that was equal parts suspicion and a raw, barely contained hope that she seemed to be trying very hard to keep off her face. He pulled his hat off his head, ran a hand through his dark hair, and put it back on. He had exactly $63 in the inside pocket of his coat. He had known that number this morning without even thinking about it, because $63 was all he had to his name after paying for his horse's shoes in the last town and buying supplies for the trail. He thought about it for exactly the space of 3 heartbeats. "I will pay the debt," he said. The crowd went very quiet. The auctioneer's gavel stayed where it was. "You will pay $200, the heavy-set banker said flatly. "No," Roscoe said, "I will pay the debt. The debt is the loan principal, and I would like to know whether $200 is the original principal or whether it includes interest accumulated since the note was issued. If this man took out a $200 loan 3 years ago and has been making payments against it, then what is owed now is not $200. There was a murmur in the crowd. The banker's watch chain caught the morning light as he straightened his coat. "There may have been some payments made," the banker said, his voice carefully neutral. "Then I want to see the ledger," Roscoe said. "Right here, right now, before you bring that hammer down on anything." The sheriff turned to look at the banker. The banker looked at the auctioneer. The auctioneer looked at his papers. Ruth Pritchard was staring at Roscoe with an expression he had still not quite figured out, but she had loosened her grip on the satchel just barely, just enough that her knuckles had gone from white to the color of bone. It took 20 minutes, and the arguing was not quiet, and Roscoe was not particularly diplomatic about it. But at the end of it all, when the bank clerk had been sent running back to the office and returned red-faced with a ledger, it was established that Thomas Pritchard had been making regular payments against the note for 2 full years before his illness had prevented him from continuing, and that the actual outstanding principal balance was not $200 but $112.40. Roscoe counted out $63 from his coat pocket and placed them on the step in front of the banker. He looked at the crowd. "I need $49.40, he said, "from anyone here who knew Thomas Pritchard and wants to do right by his daughter." The silence lasted only a moment. The flour-dusted man from the edge of the crowd was the first to move, pulling a worn billfold from his apron pocket. After him came a woman in a blue dress who opened her handbag without a word. After her came a man in a rancher's hat, and then a young woman with a baby on her hip, and then the blacksmith, who looked embarrassed about how much he was putting in, and then 3 other people in quick succession. The money was counted out on the bank step in the morning sunlight, while the auctioneer stood with his gavel hanging at his side, and the banker's face went through several colors that were not particularly healthy looking. The total came to $118.20, which was $5.80 more than was owed, and Roscoe told the banker he could keep $2 for his trouble, and the rest went back to the flour-dusted man who had given the most. The banker signed the release of the lien. The auctioneer rolled up his papers. The crowd began to disperse in that way crowds do when the thing they came to see has resolved itself into something other than what was advertised, half of them looking satisfied and half of them not quite sure what they had witnessed. Roscoe picked up his hat from where it had gotten knocked off his head in the jostling and turned around. Ruth Pritchard was standing 2 feet in front of him. She had a satchel hanging at her side now instead of gripped with both hands, and she was looking at him with the full force of those dark eyes, and he was surprised to discover that looking back at her felt like something he had not been expecting. Not just her face, though her face was striking in the clear morning light, but the whole quality of her attention, the way she looked at a person as if she were taking them apart to see what they were actually made of. "I don't know your name," she said. Her voice was low and steady, with just the slightest roughness to it that told him she had been holding herself together very hard for a very long time. "Roscoe Thatcher," he said. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Thatcher. You don't have to thank me." "I do, though." She looked down at the bank steps where the signed papers lay. They would have taken it. I had tried everything I could think of to stop it, and they would have taken it anyway. "Well," he said, and then he stopped, because he was not sure what came after well in this particular situation. He had acted on instinct and had not thought much further than the moment itself, which was a habit of his that had gotten him into complications before. "Come to the farm," she said. "Let me at least give you a meal. It is the smallest thing I can offer, and I know it, but I don't have anything else right now." He thought about the letter in his saddlebag that needed to go to the land office, and the letter was not urgent, not truly, and the roan could use a proper rest anyway. "All right," he said. The Pritchard farm was 4 miles south of town, and they traveled it together with her on a bay mare that was older than it looked and him on his roan, and neither of them said very much for the first 2 miles. The land out here was wide and golden and running with spring grass, the kind of country that got into a person's blood if they stayed long enough. The creek that ran along the south edge of the property caught the light in a way that made Roscoe slow his horse without meaning to and look at it for a long moment. "My father used to say that creek was the best thing on the land," Ruth said, watching him look at it. "He was right," Roscoe said. The farmhouse was a solid, well-built structure, plain but not poor, with a good porch along the front and a kitchen garden along the east side that had been properly turned and planted before Thomas Pritchard's health had prevented further work. There was a barn that needed a new board on the west wall and a henhouse that was in good order, and there was a vegetable cellar built into the hillside behind the house that still had last year's stores in it. Ruth unsaddled her mare in the barn with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and Roscoe unsaddled his roan beside her, and they did not talk much in the barn either. But the quiet was not uncomfortable, which was a thing Roscoe noticed because uncomfortable quiet was its own kind of loud. Inside the house, she built up the stove fire and put a pot of beans on that had been soaking since the day before, and she cut bread from a loaf she had baked 3 days ago and put it on the table, and she made coffee in a battered tin pot that had clearly been well loved for many years. He sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room while she worked. There were things on the walls that spoke of a life lived here, a framed map of the county with pencil marks on it, a shelf of books that had been read enough to show it, a calendar from the previous year that was still hanging because no one had thought to take it down. There was a rifle above the door and a pair of men's work gloves on a hook beside it that had not been moved since the last time Thomas Pritchard had taken them off. "How long since he passed?" Roscoe asked. 6 weeks and 4 days, Ruth said without turning from the stove. "Were you here when it happened?" "I was here. It was the fever. He was strong all his life, so I kept thinking he would fight through it the way he fought through everything else." She paused with the coffee pot in her hand. "He did not." "I am sorry," Roscoe said, and meant it. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him. Her hands were wrapped around the cup and she looked at the steam rising from it before she looked at him. "Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Roscoe," he said, "please." A small something shifted in her expression. "Roscoe," she said. "What you did today, I need to understand it. You rode into town this morning and you did not know me. You spent your own money and you rallied strangers and you stopped something that every legal authority in that square had already decided was going to happen. Why?" He considered the question the way he considered most things, which was to let it sit for a moment before picking it up. "Because it was wrong," he said. "Not everything wrong can be stopped, but this one could be, so I stopped it." "That is a simple answer," she said. "It was a simple thing," he said, "at the core of it." She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that seemed to be doing a kind of inventory. "Where are you from?" "Most recently, Abilene." "Before that, anywhere you can name in a broad swath from here to the Missouri border." "Do you have a home somewhere?" "Not at present," she nodded slowly. "What were you doing when you rode through today, before you stopped?" "I had a letter to deliver to the land office. Nothing that won't keep." He turned his cup in his hands. "I did not have a plan beyond that." "A man without a plan," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "I find plans generally don't survive first contact with anything real," he said. She laughed then, a short, real sound that surprised her as much as it surprised him, and for a moment something eased in her face that had been held very tight, and he saw for the first time what she looked like when she was not actively fighting to hold herself together, and it was a considerably different thing. They ate the beans and bread and drank the coffee, and she told him about the farm while they ate. She was matter-of-fact about it in a way that he found he respected enormously. The land was good, she said. Her father had chosen it well and worked it hard for 15 years. The bean crop was planted. The kitchen garden would come in well if the spring rains held. The herd was small, but the cattle were sound. The problem, she said, was that all of this was true and it didn't matter at all because she was one person, and the farm required more than one person's labor if it was going to be run properly, and she had no money to hire help and no prospect of getting any soon. "I can do most things," she said, looking at the tabletop with the flat honesty of someone who has done a lot of thinking in private and arrived at conclusions they do not particularly like. "I can farm. I can manage the cattle. I can do the accounts. My father taught me everything, but I cannot do it all by myself, and I do not know yet how to solve that." "Could you take on a hired hand, pay in board and a share of the eventual crop?" "Maybe," she said. "If I could find someone trustworthy." She looked up at him. "Are you trustworthy, Roscoe Thatcher?" He looked back at her steadily. "I am," he said. "That is not a thing I say lightly." She held his gaze for a moment, and the inventory in her eyes went very still and very careful. "I was not asking because I thought you would stay," she said. "I was asking because I was curious about the kind of man you are. And I think you are an honest man," she said. "I think honesty costs you something and you pay it anyway. That is a rarer thing than most people suppose." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she stood to clear the dishes, and neither of them spoke for a few minutes. But the quiet had taken on a different quality, warmer and less formal, like a room that has had a fire going in it long enough to lose the morning chill. He stayed that night in the barn, because she offered him the spare room and he declined it, because he was a stranger and she was alone, and it seemed the right thing to do. And she brought him a blanket and a pillow without making a discussion of it, and said good night from the barn door with the lantern light making shadows of her. He lay in the hay for a long while before sleeping, listening to the horses breathe and looking at the slats of black sky visible through the gaps in the barn wall, and thinking about the farm and the woman and the fact that he had $63 less than he had yesterday and did not regret it at all, which told him something about himself that he had not quite known before. In the morning she was up before him, which he had not expected, and the coffee was already on, and there were eggs from the hens scrambled in the iron pan by the time he came in from washing at the pump. She put the eggs on the table without ceremony and sat down across from him, and there was a directness to her morning manner that he found refreshing after years of eating alone. "I need to check the fence line along the east pasture today," she said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Two of the posts rotted out over the winter, and the cattle have been testing it. If you have time before you go, I could use a second pair of hands. I can pay you in the breakfast you have already eaten and the supper I intend to make tonight." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "That is a generous offer. It is the only offer I have," she said with that not quite a smile. He fixed the fence posts with her, working the post-hole digger into the hard spring ground while she held the wire taut and talked to him about the land in a way that revealed how completely she knew it. Every low spot where water pooled, every stretch of good grass, every place where the soil was richer or thinner. She talked about it the way a person talks about something they love without realizing they are revealing that they love it. And he listened and watched her work and felt the same feeling he had felt yesterday in the square, which was that there was something about Ruth Pritchard that was unlike anything he had encountered before. She was not fragile. That was the central fact of her. She was not a woman who needed protecting, precisely. She had already been doing everything that needed doing by herself for 6 weeks in the aftermath of grief, and she had done it without falling apart. What she needed was not protection but partnership, someone to stand beside her rather than in front of her, and there was a clarity to that distinction that lodged itself in Roscoe's mind and would not leave. At noon she produced biscuits and salt pork from a cloth she had packed in the saddlebag, and they sat on the east fence rail and ate and looked out at the cattle in the spring grass, and it was so comfortable and natural that Roscoe had to actively notice it to recognize how unusual it was. "You said last night you had no family in the county," he said. "That is right." She broke a biscuit in half and looked at it. "My mother's family was from Georgia. I never knew them. My father came west from Virginia when I was 3 years old. He had one brother who died on the trail." She paused. "There is a woman in town, Mrs. Clara Hobbs, who was my father's neighbor when he first came to the county, and she has been kind to me. But kindness does not solve the practical problem." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." "And what about you?" she said, turning to look at him directly in that way she had. "You said you have no home. Was there one once?" The question went into him somewhere uncomfortable, but he did not turn away from it because she had answered his questions plainly and deserved the same. "There was a place in Kansas," he said. "I grew up on a spread outside of Wichita. My father ran cattle. I had 2 brothers. One of them is still there, running the spread now. We parted on bad terms 7 years ago and have not spoken since." He stopped, then continued, because she was still looking at him with that quiet attention that made it easier to say things than to leave them unsaid. "The other brother died of a gunshot wound 5 years back. A dispute over water rights that should never have come to guns. I blame myself for not being there to prevent it, which I probably could not have done, but I blame myself anyway." "I am sorry," she said, and the way she said it was the same way he had said it to her the evening before, simple and direct and carrying real weight. "The restlessness came after that," he said. "I have been moving ever since. Taking work where I find it, riding where the road goes." He turned the biscuit in his hands. "I had begun to wonder, somewhere in the last year, whether I was waiting for something without knowing what it was." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not read, and then she looked back out at the cattle. I used to think I was one of those people who needed a great deal of space and solitude, she said carefully. My father used to say I was a person who preferred quality to quantity in company. I thought that was true. She paused. I have had 6 weeks of solitude now, and I find I do not prefer it at all. He looked at her profile against the wide sky and felt something settle in his chest, quiet and certain, like a key turning in a lock he had not known was there. He delivered the letter to the land office the following morning, riding into Harlan's Creek early and returning by midday. The town looked different to him already than it had 2 days ago, familiar in a way that a place is not usually familiar after only 2 days, and he thought about that on the ride back and concluded it was not the town that felt familiar but the direction he was riding in. When he got back to the farm, Ruth was in the kitchen garden on her knees in the dirt, setting out seedlings from a flat with the focused attention she gave to everything. She looked up when she heard the horse, and there was something in her face for just a moment before she rearranged it into her usual composure, something quick and warm, and he pretended not to notice it, because she was a woman who valued her dignity, and he was not going to make sport of an unguarded moment. He unsaddled the roan, and then came and knelt in the dirt beside her, and held the flat while she transferred the seedlings. She told him what each plant was and where it needed to go, and he did what she said and did it carefully, and when they were done they washed their hands at the pump side by side and the backs of their hands touched in the water and neither of them moved away. He looked at her. She looked at him. The pump dripped between them. "I have been thinking," he said, "about whether you would be amenable to me staying on. Not permanently, I am not proposing anything permanent but for the season. Through the planting and the first cut of hay. You need the help, and I have no pressing obligation elsewhere, and I find I am not particularly interested in leaving." She was quiet for a moment, looking at their hands in the water. Then she looked up at him. "That is a practical arrangement," she said. "It is," he agreed. "On that basis," she said, "I am amenable." He moved his few belongings from the barn into the spare room the following morning, and she did not remark on it and neither did he, and they settled into a rhythm that was so quickly and naturally established that Roscoe found himself marveling at it privately. They worked together from early morning, dividing the tasks between them with very little discussion required, because they had the same instinct about what needed doing first and the same habit of doing it thoroughly before moving on to the next thing. He repaired the west wall of the barn. She mended the kitchen garden fence that the deer had been getting through. He checked the cattle and found 2 cows that were close to calving and set up a watch on them. She went to town for supplies and came back with flour and salt and 2 pounds of coffee and a length of new rope that she had judged necessary. And she showed him the accounts book in the evening and went through the numbers with him without embarrassment, because she trusted him now with the practical reality of the situation, and that trust had happened quickly but did not feel fragile. The calves came on a Thursday night, both of them, healthy and strong, and they were in the barn for most of it. Ruth with her sleeves rolled up and her hair down because there had not been time to pin it. And when the second calf got to its feet and shook its big damp head in the lantern light, they both laughed at the same moment, and the sound of it in the warm barn was something Roscoe put away in himself, somewhere he did not usually keep things. Mrs. Clara Hobbs came out from town on a Saturday afternoon with a jar of preserves and the transparent intention of having a look at the stranger who had moved onto the Pritchard place. She was a woman of perhaps 55 with sharp eyes and an expression that reserved judgment while very actively forming it, and she sat in the parlor with Ruth and drank tea and asked Roscoe questions that were apparently about his journey from Abilene but were actually about his character and intentions, and he answered them honestly because he had nothing to hide, and because he could see she was protecting Ruth in the way that someone protects a person they genuinely care for. When she left, she shook his hand at the door and said, "You have good manners, Mr. Thatcher," in a way that was simultaneously a compliment and a warning, and he nodded and said he hoped to continue deserving the observation. Ruth closed the door behind her and turned with an expression that was trying not to be amused. "She means well," Ruth said. "I know it," Roscoe said. "I'm glad you have someone looking out for you." Ruth looked at him for a moment. "I seem to have acquired several people in that capacity recently," she said carefully. "Is that all right?" She considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything. "It is entirely all right," she said. "It is more than all right. I am simply not entirely sure what to do with it yet." He wanted to say something then. Something about what he had been thinking since the garden and since the barn and since 100 quiet moments in the days between. But he looked at her in the late afternoon light in the parlor doorway and thought she was not quite ready. And he was not entirely sure he was either. And some things were better for waiting. He took on a paid job in the 3rd week, riding fence for a larger ranch a few miles north for 3 days. And when he came back with $20 in his pocket, he gave Ruth 15 of it and she objected. And he said he was paying for his board and she said she had not charged him board and he said he knew it and that was the point. They argued about it for 6 minutes and then she took the money and put it in the accounts book and did not thank him out loud. But the way she looked at him when she did it was a kind of gratitude that went considerably deeper than words. In town one afternoon, he heard something at the feed store that sat badly with him. 2 men talking at the counter about how the bank, specifically the heavy-set banker whose name turned out to be Cornelius Fogg, had been acquiring land in the county at an aggressive rate, calling in loans, buying up properties at auction, accumulating holdings that were starting to look less like business and more like something deliberate and concerning. Roscoe bought his supplies without offering his own thoughts on the matter and rode back to the farm thinking. He told Ruth that evening because he believed she had a right to know everything that concerned her land. She sat at the kitchen table and listened and looked at the accounts book that lay open in front of her. "I suspected as much," she said. "There were 2 other families in the valley who had their land called in over the winter, the Harrisons and the Dones. They had to leave the county." She folded her hands on the table. "Fogg wants this land, I believe. He has wanted it for 2 years. The creek is the reason. Good water is worth a great deal in this country." "He will try again," Roscoe said. "A man like that does not give up after one reversal." "I know it," she said. "I have been thinking about it since that morning in the square. The debt is paid now, but he will find another angle if he is determined." "Then we need to be prepared for it," Roscoe said. She looked at him across the table, and the word we sat between them and neither of them addressed it directly, but it was there, and they both knew it. They engaged a lawyer from the county seat the following week. A thin, energetic man named James Colby, who rode out to the farm and looked at the deed and the paid-off note and the property records with the focused delight of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work, and told them that the deed was clean, and that Fogg had no further legal claim against the property, but that there were other mechanisms a determined man could use, such as disputing the original survey or claiming a road easement through the property, and that they should keep their records in order and their documentation airtight. He charged them $5 for the consultation, and Ruth paid it from the farm account and wrote it down in the accounts book in her careful, precise hand, and Roscoe watched her do it, and felt a surge of something that was more than admiration. And he let himself acknowledge that, privately, in the part of himself, where he was starting to keep all the Ruth-related things that were accumulating faster than he had anticipated. It was a warm evening in late May, when things shifted between them in a way that could not be put back to where they had been. They had been sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sky go through its colors over the western hills, and she had been reading aloud from a book of poetry she had taken from the shelf inside, one of her father's books, and he had been listening with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the darkening sky, and her voice in the evening air had settled over him like something warm and complete. She stopped reading mid-poem and was quiet for a moment. "Roscoe," she said. "Ruth," he said. "I need to say something, and I am not sure how to say it in a way that does not risk something I do not want to risk." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the book in her hands rather than at him. "Say it anyway," he said. She looked up. The last of the evening light was on her face, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that never said less than exactly what was true. "I think about you when you are not in the room," she said. "I have not done that with anyone before. And when you ride out for any reason, I watch the road until you come back. And I do not care for the way that feels while I am waiting, because it makes me understand that you could not come back, and that is a thought I find I cannot tolerate." He looked at her for a long moment. The book was very still in her hands. A night hawk called somewhere in the darkening sky. "Ruth," he said, "I have been trying to find the right time and the right way to tell you something for 3 weeks." "Tell me," she said. "When I rode into Harlan's Creek that morning, I had no idea what I was riding toward. I had been moving for 5 years without feeling like I was going anywhere. And then I saw you in that square, holding onto that satchel, and I cannot explain to you why that particular moment mattered to me the way it did, except that something in me recognized something in you, and I have not stopped feeling that since." She was very still. "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give," he said. "I am not going anywhere. I want you to know that I am staying, not because of the fence posts or the planting or the calves or anything practical. I am staying because you are here and because I would like very much to keep building the thing we are building if you want to build it." She closed the book. She set it on the porch rail beside her. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held it. And they sat like that in the dark for a long time, and it was the simplest and most complete thing Roscoe had felt in his adult life. He kissed her for the first time that night, standing at the porch door when they went in, and it was brief and quiet, and it undid something in both of them that had been held very carefully in place. And she looked at him afterward with such a full, open expression that he understood he was seeing Ruth Pritchard without any of her armor on, and it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever been shown. June brought the first real summer heat, and with it the community of Harlan's Creek began to know that Roscoe Thatcher was not passing through but staying, and this produced a variety of responses. Mrs. Hobbs approved, cautiously and then not so cautiously, and began leaving things on the farm porch with the regularity of a woman who had decided a thing and was not going back on it. The flour-dusted man from the crowd, whose name turned out to be Ed Muller and who ran the general store, greeted Roscoe by first name when he came in for supplies, and asked after the farm with the interest of someone who had invested something of himself in its welfare. The sheriff, whose name was Walt Greer, stopped Roscoe on the street one morning and said, with a kind of labored honesty, that he was sorry for how he had handled the morning of the auction, and that he hoped Roscoe did not think too poorly of him. And Roscoe said people made choices under pressure, and the choices told you who they were, and that the question was who they chose to be afterward, which seemed to satisfy the sheriff. Cornelius Fogg did not speak to Roscoe. When their paths crossed in town, which they did twice in the month of June, Fogg looked through him with the particular expression of a man storing up a grievance for later use. Ruth had been right that Fogg would try again. The method he chose, when he chose it, was a survey dispute. He filed a claim with the county recorder in mid-June asserting that a portion of the Pritchard property, specifically the stretch running along Tanner Creek, had been incorrectly surveyed when the original deed was drawn, and that his adjacent landholding actually extended to a line 40 feet further north than the current survey showed, which would, if accepted, give Fogg's property direct creek access. James Colby came out from the county seat in a great hurry when Roscoe sent for him, and spent a day going over the original survey documentation and the historical land records with the focused energy of a man who had found something worth being angry about. "He is wrong," Colby said flatly, sitting at the Pritchard kitchen table with papers spread from one end to the other. The original survey was done by a licensed surveyor in 1867, and the methodology is documented and sound. Fogg's filing is based on a remeasurement done by a man who is on Fogg's payroll, which is not exactly a neutral party. We can contest this in county court and we will win. How long will it take? Ruth asked. Could be 2 months, could be 4, depends on the docket. Colby looked at her over his glasses. But I want to be honest with you, Miss Pritchard. Even if we win, which I believe we will, Fogg has resources we don't have, and a patient man can file a lot of nuisance claims. Roscoe had been sitting quietly at the end of the table through this, and he said, then we need to make the cost of those filings outweigh the potential benefit to him. How do you propose to do that? Colby asked. By making the disputed land clearly, demonstrably, and publicly in productive use, Roscoe said. A man trying to strip working farmland from a working farmer in a county where people vote on everything is a man making enemies. He looked at Ruth. We dig an irrigation channel from the creek to the south field. We document it. We survey it ourselves with a licensed surveyor, and we use it to bring in twice the crop yield we'd otherwise manage. We make this land so obviously and so completely Ruth's that there's no version of Fogg's argument that doesn't look like theft to anyone paying attention. Ruth looked at him across the table. Something in her expression did the thing it sometimes did now, where it went from her public face to the private one very quickly and very completely, and she said, that would require a significant amount of work. I know it, he said, and we would need a surveyor and a good engineer. Colby can source the surveyor. The engineering is within our ability if we plan it carefully. She looked at the papers on the table and then at him. All right, she said. They hired the surveyor from the county seat, and he came in 2 weeks. And while he was there, Roscoe had him document and certify the existing property lines with thorough precision, and file the documentation with the county recorder in such a way that Fogg's competing claim would have a great deal to argue against. The irrigation channel was a 2-month project, and it was the hardest physical work Roscoe had done in years. They hired Ed Muller's son, a strong, quiet young man of 18 named Henry, to help for a share of the wages, and the 3 of them worked the channel through the summer heat, digging and shoring and laying pipe where they could get it and building sluice gates by hand where they couldn't. Ruth worked beside them on the sections nearest the house. She was not precious about it. She picked up a shovel and used it with the same focused precision she brought to everything, and Henry Muller, who had clearly not expected this, watched her with a kind of respectful wonder that Roscoe found quietly amusing. At the end of July, the county court dismissed Fogg's survey claim. Colby sent word by telegram, and Roscoe brought the telegram to Ruth in the kitchen garden where she was working, and she read it standing in the dirt between the bean rows with a streak of earth on her forehead, and she looked up at him with such a sudden and complete relief in her face that something tightened in his chest. It is over, she said. The survey claim is over, he said. There may be other things, but yes, for now, this one is over. She sat down right there in the dirt between the bean rows and pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes, and he sat down beside her in the dirt without thinking about it, and she turned and put her face against his shoulder and stayed there for a long moment, and he put his arm around her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not already known. Fogg did not file again. Whether it was the clean survey documentation, or the public attention the case had drawn, or some calculation he had made about the expense of fighting a claim with a lawyer as enthusiastic as James Colby, Roscoe was not certain. But the filing stopped, and a month later word came through that Fogg had sold his Harlan County holdings and departed for Denver, which Ed Muller delivered as news with the satisfied expression of a man checking something off a list. August was hot and full, and the harvest came in better than either of them had dared to predict. The irrigation channel had done exactly what Roscoe had said it would, and the south field that had been dry farming in poor years came in with a yield that made Ruth sit with the accounts book for a long evening in October and look at the numbers with an expression of quiet, careful astonishment. We are ahead, she said. We are meaningfully ahead, enough to pay Henry for the season and still have a surplus. I know, he said. He was sitting across from her at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast every morning for 5 months. She closed the accounts book and looked at him. They had been circling something for weeks now without quite arriving at it, and he could feel the weight of it between them like a question waiting to be asked out loud. "Roscoe," she said. "I know," he said. "We haven't spoken about I know," he said. "I have been trying to find the right time again. I seem to have the same problem every time with you." She looked at him steadily. "Just say it." He leaned forward and put his hands on the table and looked at her across the lamplight. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the farm or the accounts or any of the practical circumstances of this year, though all of that has been the best work of my life. Because you are the only person I have ever met who makes me feel like staying is not a compromise but a destination. Because you are the most capable and honest and surprising person I know, and I want to spend the rest of my life being surprised by you." He paused. "And because I love you. I have loved you since sometime in the 3rd week, and I have been extraordinarily disciplined about not saying so until the right moment." She looked at him for a long moment with the lamplight on her face. "The 3rd week," she said. "Approximately," he said. "I loved you by the end of the 1st, she said, "but I was not going to say so first." He stared at her. "Ruth." "You were very slow about it," she said, and there was no hiding the smile now, the full one that she had been careful with from the beginning, and it was radiant in the lamplight, and he had been waiting for it for months. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took both her hands, and she stood, and he kissed her with all the months of restraint behind it, and she kissed him back without any restraint at all, and when they stepped apart she was still smiling, and he thought he had never seen anything as fine as Ruth Pritchard smiling in the lamplight in her own kitchen. "Yes," she said, in case he had forgotten to wait for the answer. "Good," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. They were married in November in the small church in Harlan's Creek, on a clear cold morning with the hills winter brown, and the sky that deep western blue that seemed to go up forever. Clara Hobbs sat in the front row with a handkerchief she did not use but held prepared. Ed Muller and his son Henry filled half a pew. James Colby rode up from the county seat and stood in the back. Sheriff Walt Greer came in his good coat and removed his hat, and held it at his side for the whole ceremony, with the expression of a man who had decided to make something right in himself. Ruth wore her mother's dress, which she had altered to fit and pressed with meticulous care, and her hair was down under a small wreath of dried wildflowers that Clara Hobbs had made for her. When she walked up the aisle on her own, because there was no father to take her arm, she walked straight and steady, and Roscoe stood at the altar and watched her come to him, and felt something in him that was so large and so complete that he would not have been able to name it except to call it the rest of his life arriving. The ceremony was simple, and the pastor, a patient man named Reverend Aldrich who had been in the county longer than anyone, spoke a few plain words about the nature of real partnership and the quality of endurance that love requires, and Roscoe listened to it and thought it was exactly right. When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," Roscoe took Ruth's face in both his hands and kissed her, and Clara Hobbs deployed the handkerchief. There was a gathering afterward in the church hall that Clara Hobbs had organized with the efficiency of a military campaign, involving more food than Roscoe had seen in one place since he could not remember when. And the warmth of it, the way these people who had known Ruth her whole life came up to him one after another and shook his hand or pressed his arm, and welcomed him into the place they had made for her in their community, was something he had not anticipated, and found he did not have any defenses against. Late in the evening, when the food was mostly gone and the older guests had begun drifting toward home and Henry Muller was asleep in a corner, Ruth came and found him where he was standing near the window looking out at the dark fields, and she leaned against his arm and he put his arm around her and they stood there together looking out at the land. "That went well," she said. "Better than well," he said. She tilted her head to look up at him. "Are you happy?" He considered it the way he considered everything, seriously and without rushing. "I have not been this settled in my entire adult life," he said. Settled is not a word I have ever applied to myself before, but yes, happy is the exact right word. She put her hand over his where it rested at her waist. Good, she said. So am I. They drove home to the farm in the hired wagon through the cold November dark, bundled in blankets, the horse's breath making clouds in the air ahead of them, and when they turned down the road toward the farm and the house appeared in the moonlight with its windows dark, Roscoe stopped the wagon for a moment and looked at it. What is it? Ruth asked. Nothing, he said. I just wanted to look at it. She looked at it with him. The plain, solid farmhouse with the good porch and the barn behind it and the creek catching the moonlight to the south. It is ours, she said. Yes, he said. It is. He clicked the horse forward and drove them home. The winter settled in properly after the wedding and life took on the particular rhythm of a farm in the cold months, slower and more inward, full of the small tasks that summer crowds out. Roscoe repaired harnesses and sharpened tools and spent a long week reinforcing the barn against the wind, and Ruth worked on the accounts and the seed orders for spring and made things in the kitchen that filled the house with warmth. In the evenings they read together by the fire, taking turns with whatever book was current, or talked in the comfortable, ranging way that people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's minds and not merely filling the silence. He wrote a letter to his brother in Wichita. He had been thinking about it since before the wedding, and Ruth had not pushed him, but he had caught her looking at him once or twice when he had the pen and paper out and then put them away again, and her eyes had said something he understood but did not need her to say. The letter was hard to write, and he wrote 3 drafts and burned 2 of them and sent the third, which was brief and honest and asked nothing except whether there was a possibility of being brothers again. The answer came back in February, just as brief, just as honest, from a man named Daniel Thatcher who said he had wondered for 7 years how to start this conversation and was glad someone had done it. Roscoe read the letter at the kitchen table with Ruth across from him, and when he put it down, she reached across and covered his hand with hers without saying anything, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that until the fire needed another log. In the spring, Ruth told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen garden of all places, on a morning in late March when she was kneeling in the turned earth planting the first of the seeds, and she looked up at him with that open, private face she showed him and said, I need to tell you something. She told him, watching his face. She did not look away. He went down on his knees in the garden dirt beside her, not caring about his trousers, and he took her hands in both of his and looked at her face, which had the full expression on it now, the one with no armor at all, joy and fear and love all present simultaneously. Ruth, he said. He could not quite get further than that at first. We are going to need to expand the kitchen garden, she said with the smallest, most beautiful tremor in her voice. Considerably. He laughed, a real, full sound, and she laughed with him, and he pulled her forward and held her with his chin on the top of her head and the spring sun warm on both their backs. Are you all right? He said. I am perfectly well, she said against his shoulder. I am also terrified. So am I, he said. Completely terrified, but happy, she said. Incomparably, he said. He helped her up and brushed the dirt from her skirt, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him in the kitchen garden in the spring morning, and the farm spread around them, and the creek ran in the distance, and it was everything. Clara Hobbs arrived 3 days later, having apparently developed a sense for information, and sat with Ruth for a long afternoon making plans with the focused joy of a woman who had been waiting for this news and intended to do her full part. She had opinions about names, delivery arrangements, necessary purchases, and the optimal placement of a cradle relative to the bedroom window, all of which she delivered while knitting something small and yellow with great speed. Roscoe watched from the kitchen doorway and felt a warmth for Clara Hobbs that was entirely new and rather overwhelming. Daniel Thatcher wrote again in April, a longer letter this time. He was still in Wichita. He had a wife named Margaret and 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He said his wife had made him write more than once, but he had always lost his nerve. He said he thought about their brother James every spring. He said he was glad about the farm and glad about Ruth, and that if they were ever in Wichita they should come to the house. Roscoe wrote back the same day and said they would come, next year if the farm allowed it, and that there was a great deal of lost time to make up for, and he intended to start making it up. The planting season of 1883 was the best they had managed, partly because the irrigation channel was fully functional now, and partly because Roscoe had spent the winter working out a better rotation plan based on what they had learned from the previous year. Henry Muller came back for the season, and they hired a second hand as well, an older man named Art Finley who had been farming in the county for 30 years and knew the land better than he knew much else. Art worked quietly and steadily and said little but nodded a great deal, which Roscoe came to understand was a form of comprehensive approval. Ruth worked through the spring with the same energy she always did, though Roscoe watched her carefully for exhaustion and redirected the heavier work without making a fuss of it, which she was aware of and did not object to, which told him she was being sensible rather than proud, which he was grateful for. In June, she felt the child move for the first time and called him in from the barn to tell him, and when she took his hand and pressed it flat against her side, the reality of it went through him like a current, enormous and specific simultaneously. The summer was long and golden and full of work, and the accounts book grew steadily more comfortable, and the farm grew steadily more productive, and in the evenings on the porch Roscoe would sit beside Ruth in the cooling air, and they would talk about things large and small, about the farm and the future and the people in their lives and the books they were reading, and the things they had seen. And sometimes they would not talk at all but just sit in the presence of each other and the darkening land and feel the completeness of what they had built. He had been a man in motion for 5 years, and now he was still, and the stillness was not emptiness but the opposite of it. The baby came in August, early enough in the month that the summer heat was at its worst, and Clara Hobbs arrived the morning of with 3 other women including the local midwife, a competent, unhurried woman named Mrs. Slade, who had brought half the county into the world and was not alarmed by anything. Roscoe was directed to the porch and stayed there for 7 hours. Art Finley, who had apparently expected this development, materialized on the porch mid-morning with a pot of coffee and 2 cups and sat down in the other chair and kept Roscoe company in almost complete silence, which was exactly the right kind of company for the occasion. A boy. They brought him a boy, 6 pounds and perfectly healthy, with Ruth's dark eyes and a quantity of black hair that Clara Hobbs said was remarkable, and Roscoe held him in the bedroom doorway with both hands and looked at his son's face for a long time without saying anything, and then he looked at Ruth, who was exhausted and radiant in the afternoon light against her pillows, and his heart did something so large he thought the walls of the room could probably feel it. "Hello," he said to the baby. It was all he had. "He needs a name," Ruth said, watching him with those dark eyes. They had discussed names. He had a list in his coat pocket that they had been adding to for months. He looked at the baby and then at his wife and said, "James, if that is all right with you." She looked at him with the full expression, no armor anywhere, and said, "That is exactly right." James Thomas Thatcher was born in August of 1883, named for the 2 men who had not lived to see this day, and he was loud and healthy and opinionated from the start, which Ruth said he had gotten from Roscoe, and Roscoe said he had clearly gotten it from her, and they had this argument cheerfully for years. The letter Roscoe wrote to Daniel that week was the longest he had ever written in his life. Daniel wrote back within a fortnight and said that Margaret cried at the news and that the children wanted to know when they could meet their cousin, and that he intended to bring the family to Harlan's Creek in the spring of next year if Roscoe would have them. And Roscoe wrote back and said to come as soon as the roads would allow it. Life on the farm in the months after James's birth had the particular quality of something being built day by day from the inside out. There were hard days, days when James would not sleep, and the cattle needed attention, and the weather turned difficult all at once. And there were quiet days and there were full days. Ruth moved through all of them with the same focused capability she brought to everything, adapting as she always had to what was needed, and Roscoe moved through them beside her. And the rhythms they had established in the first season were deeper now, embedded in the daily texture of their shared life. Clara Hobbs came twice a week and fussed over James with a devotion that James accepted with the regal calm of someone who understood his position. Ed Muller presented a carved wooden rattle at the general store counter when Roscoe came in for flour, produced from under the counter with the careful offhandedness of a man who had been waiting to give it, and was trying not to make a scene of it. Art Finley carved a small wooden horse for the baby without mentioning it, which Ruth found one morning on the porch step. The community of Harlan's Creek had taken Ruth and Roscoe and their farm into itself by now in the complete way that small communities absorb the things they have decided to claim. And Roscoe, who had spent 5 years belonging nowhere, found himself belonging somewhere so thoroughly that the contrast made him briefly dizzy when he thought about it. There was a night in October when James was 2 months old and they had finally gotten him to sleep at a reasonable hour, and they sat on the porch together in the cold with coffee cups in their hands and the stars so dense above them that the sky looked crowded with light. And Ruth said quietly, "I think about that morning sometimes." "So do I," he said. "I have tried to imagine what would have happened if you had not ridden into town that day." She shook her head. "I cannot make myself see it. The house sold, the land gone, me with nothing. I had thought about going to St. Louis, trying to find work as a teacher, but I had no money for the journey and I did not know what I would do when I got there." She paused. "I do not say this to make you feel necessary to my survival because you are not. I would have found something." "I know you would have," he said. "I say it to make you understand what that morning was, not just practically. I had stood there in that square and watched everything my father spent his life building about to be hammered away, and I could not stop it, and then you walked out of nowhere and stopped it." She looked at the stars. "And I did not like needing help. I have never liked needing help, but there was something about the way you did it that did not feel like being rescued. It felt like someone standing next to me." He turned to look at her profile. "That was what I was trying to do," he said. "I know," she said. "I knew it then actually in the moment, which was why I was not angry. I am usually very angry when people try to rescue me." "I have gathered," he said. She turned to look at him with that smile. "You are very good at standing next to me," she said. "I intend to keep it up," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat in the cold and the starlight with the baby sleeping inside and the farm dark and settled around them. And it was as good as anything Roscoe had ever known. Daniel Thatcher arrived with his family in April of 1884, a wagon full of people. His wife Margaret, who was warm and practical, and took one look at Ruth, and clearly decided she was exactly right. And their 3 children, Robert, who was 7, Tom, who was 5, and a girl called Me, who was 3, and immediately attached herself to baby James with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for a younger person to supervise. The 2 brothers stood in the yard and looked at each other for a long moment with the weight of 7 years between them. And then Daniel said, "I should have written sooner," and Roscoe said, "So should I." And they shook hands, and then Daniel pulled him into a brief, hard embrace, and the 7 years went into the past where they belonged. Margaret and Ruth became friends with a speed and completeness that impressed both their husbands, who observed the phenomenon from a safe distance. By the second evening of the visit, Margaret was in the kitchen helping Ruth with supper, and they were talking with the focused animation of people who have discovered they think about things in similar ways and are delighted by the discovery. The family stayed for 2 weeks, and when they left it was with firm plans for a return visit in the fall, and Roscoe stood in the road and watched the wagon go and felt the thing that had been broken in him 7 years ago close over and heal, not as if it had never happened, but as if it had happened and been survived, and the surviving was part of him now. Ruth came and stood beside him while the wagon was still visible on the road. "He is a good man," she said. "He is," Roscoe said. "He is like our father in the ways our father was good, and not like him in the ways our father was not." "That is usually the best you can hope for," Ruth said. He put his arm around her shoulders and they watched the dust settle where the wagon had gone. The years that followed were years of full, layered, ordinary happiness, which is the most extraordinary kind. The farm grew more productive with each season as Roscoe and Ruth refined what they knew about its soil and water, and the particular ways it needed to be worked. They added a new section of fencing, improved the barn considerably, and in the fall of 1885 built a proper second bedroom for the house that they finished just before they needed it for their daughter, Margaret Ruth Thatcher, who arrived in November with the same dark eyes as her brother and a temperament that was quieter and more observant, watching the world from the beginning with the serious attention of someone who intended to understand it. Ruth taught both children from the time they could sit still enough to hold a slate, with the same rigor and warmth she brought to everything else, and James was a determined if impatient student and Margaret was a meticulous one, who corrected her brother's arithmetic with a calm precision that drove him to distraction and delighted her parents privately. In 1886, Roscoe made the trip to Wichita with Ruth and the two children, the first time he had been back to Kansas in years. Daniel met them at the road and they pulled up to the farmstead that had been his father's, and for a moment Roscoe sat on the wagon and looked at it, the familiar and the changed, and felt the whole complicated weight of it. Ruth's hand found his on the seat of the wagon. He looked at her. She looked at him with those dark eyes that had never stopped seeing him clearly. He helped her down from the wagon and they walked to the house together. The farm in Harlan's Creek continued to grow. By the late 1880s, it was one of the more productive operations in the county, known for the quality of its cattle and the reliability of its yields, and Roscoe's reputation in the area had become that of a man whose word was absolute and whose knowledge of the land was worth consulting. He was not interested in being important, but he was interested in being useful, and the two things had arrived at the same destination by different roads. James grew into a boy who was curious about everything and afraid of nothing, who followed his father around the farm from the time he could walk and asked questions with a relentlessness that Roscoe answered patiently, because he had found that the relentlessness was the thing worth encouraging. By the time James was 5, he knew the names of every plant on the property and the general nature of how the irrigation system worked, and Roscoe watched him process this information and thought of his own father, and was glad that the things he had learned were finding their way forward. Margaret read everything she could get her hands on and had strong opinions about most of it. She and her mother had a particular bond that Roscoe observed with a pleasure he could not entirely articulate. The way they talked to each other as absolute equals from the time Margaret was very young. The way Ruth encouraged her daughter's intelligence and directness the same way Thomas Pritchard had encouraged Ruth's. Clara Hobbs came to the farm until she was too old to make the ride, and then they went to her, and she was part of the texture of their life in a way that was family by every measure that mattered except blood. When she became ill in 1889, it was Ruth who went into town and managed her care with the same focused, practical love she gave to everything. And when Clara Hobbs died in early March of that year, peaceful and attended, Ruth sat with Roscoe on the porch that evening and said, "She made me feel less alone in the first year. I do not know if she ever understood how much that mattered." "She knew," Roscoe said. "I hope so," Ruth said. They were quiet together in the spring dark, and it was a grief that was real and whole, and they sat with it the way people who trust each other sit with difficult things, together, and without trying to make it smaller than it was. Ed Muller's son Henry married a girl from the neighboring county in 1888, and Roscoe and Ruth attended the wedding with James and Margaret, and it was a warm celebration that went on into the evening, and at one point Roscoe found himself standing near the edge of the dancing with Ed Muller beside him, both of them watching their respective families in the lantern light. "You did a good thing that morning," Ed said, without looking at him, meaning the morning in 1882 that they both still occasionally reference the way people reference things that turned out to be hinge points. "I have thought about it since. I gave my money and I was glad to do it, but you were the one who stopped the whole machine long enough for it to be possible." "Someone had to," Roscoe said. "That is not actually true," Ed said. "Plenty of things happen that someone could stop and nobody does. That's what made it worth remarking." Roscoe looked across the dancing to where Ruth was talking to Henry's new bride with the complete attention she gave to people she was making welcome. And he thought about that Tuesday morning in 1882 when he had ridden into Harlan's Creek with $63 and a letter to deliver and a general restlessness. And he thought about the fact that the smallest possible variation, an earlier departure, a different road, a horse that had not needed water at that particular moment, would have put him somewhere else entirely that morning. The thought was briefly vertiginous. "I am glad I stopped," he said. "So are we all," Ed said, and raised his glass. In the autumn of 1890 they had a third child, a son they named Daniel William, in honor of both brothers in their respective families, and he came into the world with a great deal of opinion about the process, and continued to have opinions about everything thereafter. He was different from both his siblings, louder and more immediately social, with a grin that appeared early and stayed, and the household, which had been full before, became considerably fuller. James was 7 by then and took his position as eldest with a seriousness that was half genuine and half performance, and Margaret, 5, observed her new brother with the analytical attention she gave to everything and declared within the first week that he was going to be a great deal of trouble, which was accurate. Ruth managed all of it with the same unflappable competence that had carried her through everything since the beginning, though Roscoe noticed in the quieter moments, the late evenings after the children were in bed, and she sat by the fire with the mending or the accounts, a tiredness in her that had not been there in the earlier years, and he made sure that the tiredness was never without relief. That there was always a hand at her shoulder or a cup of coffee appearing, or a morning where he took all 3 children to the barn early so she could sleep past sunrise. She noticed. She always noticed. "You are very attentive," she said one morning, looking at him over her coffee with the expression that was fond and slightly amused. "I pay attention," he said. "It is a habit I acquired." "When?" "Early April, 1882, he said. She smiled then, the full one, and he thought, as he had thought 1,000 times, that he would never stop being glad he had not ridden around the town square that Tuesday morning. The decade turned and the children grew, and the farm grew with them, and the life they had built in Harlan's Creek had the solidity of something that had been tested and had held. There were hard seasons and there were good ones. There were illnesses that frightened them and recoveries that relieved them. There were arguments about decisions and agreements that followed. There were grief and celebration, and the ordinary daily texture that accumulates into a life so gradually you do not see it happening, and then one day you look back and it is immense. James, at 10, had his father's focused quiet and his mother's direct intelligence, and was beginning to show a particular talent for the management of the land that Roscoe watched develop with a pride he was careful not to make suffocating. He took the boy with him on the working decisions of the farm, explaining his reasoning and asking for James's observations, and the observations were often worth having. Margaret, at 8, had decided she wanted to be a teacher and was reading everything she could find on the subject, and had already, on 2 occasions, organized the other children in the area into something that resembled a school session, conducted in the barn with a stick of chalk and a piece of board, with a natural authority that made all the other children pay attention without entirely understanding why. Daniel, at 3, had decided that the chickens were his personal responsibility, and managed them with a combination of enthusiasm and chaos that kept the farm in a state of mild poultry-related drama. One evening in the fall, when the harvest was in and the accounts were good and all three children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the way it was only in the late hours, Roscoe and Ruth sat on the porch under a sky full of stars with blankets across their laps and cups of coffee going cold on the rail beside them. And Ruth said, "Do you remember what you said to me, the first time you proposed staying? You said you had been moving for 5 years without feeling like you were going anywhere." "I remember," he said. "Do you feel like you are somewhere now?" He looked at the dark farm, the barn outlined against the stars, the creek invisible in the dark but audible, the faint sound of the cattle in the near pasture. "I feel like I am exactly somewhere," he said. "This particular somewhere which is the only one I want." She reached across and took his hand. He held hers, warm and familiar and entirely Ruth, and they sat in the quiet of what they had made together. "My father chose this land," she said. "He came west from Virginia and he looked at everything available and he chose this particular place, with this creek and this soil and these hills." She paused. "I used to think that was his legacy, the choosing. And now," he said, "now I think the land was always just the setting," she said. "The legacy was the willingness to build something that would outlast him." She looked out at the dark. "We are building that. James and Margaret and Daniel will know this land the way I know it in the body and the bones. And they will build on it after us and maybe their children after them. That is what my father was actually doing when he chose this place. He was starting something." He thought about Thomas Pritchard, who he had never met and knew only through what Ruth had told him and what he could see in the character of the daughter Thomas had raised and the farm Thomas had built. He thought about the morning the banker had tried to auction it all away, and the way it had been stopped by a collection of ordinary things, a stranger on a horse, a crowd with their wallets, and the particular quality of one woman's refusal to stop standing. "He started it well," Roscoe said. "He did," she said. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and pulled her close, and they stayed on the porch in the cold until the coffee was entirely cold and the stars had moved a measurable distance across the sky. And then they went inside and closed the door against the October night, and the farm was quiet around them, and the children were sleeping, and the fire was low and warm. And the life they had built from a Tuesday morning in a town square, and the refusal to let something wrong happen when it was possible to stop it was entirely, completely, warmly theirs. In the spring of 1892, Daniel Thatcher and his family came for what had become an annual visit, and the combined families of both brothers filled the farmhouse and the yard and the barn with the comfortable noise of people who know each other well and like each other genuinely. And the children of both families ran through the spring grass with the absolute authority of children who believe the world was made for their particular enjoyment. On the last evening of the visit, when the younger children were in bed and the older ones were almost there, and the adults sat around the kitchen table with the remnants of supper, Daniel looked at Roscoe across the table with an expression that was direct and a little bit weighted. "I want you to know something," Daniel said. "All right," Roscoe said. "When you wrote to me that first letter, I had made a decision that you were gone from my life and I had made my peace with it, or thought I had. And when I got that letter, I sat on the porch with it for about an hour without opening it because I did not know what I wanted it to say." He paused. "And then I opened it and it was you, the exact way you have always been, direct and a little too honest and entirely without pretension. And I remembered why we were friends before we were brothers, and I was very glad you wrote." Roscoe looked at his brother across the kitchen table that his wife had built a life around, in the kitchen that his father-in-law had built, on land that 3 generations were in the process of claiming together. "I was very glad you answered," he said. Ruth, across from him, was watching them both with the expression she had when something moved her, but she did not want to make it larger than it was by naming it. Margaret's small hand appeared from under the table and patted her mother's knee, which meant Margaret had not been as close to sleep as advertised, and Ruth looked down at her daughter with a smile that went all the way through her. Later, much later, When the house was quiet and the guests were settled and the night had gone deep and dark, Roscoe stood at the window of their bedroom and looked out at the land in the moonlight. Ruth came and stood beside him, her shoulder against his arm, looking out at what he was looking at. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He thought about how to say it accurately. "I am thinking that this is what I was waiting for," he said. "When I was riding and had no destination, I did not know what I was waiting for, but it was this exact particular life." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It is a very good life," she said. "It is the best I can imagine," he said. They stood at the window together for a while, looking out at the moonlit farm and the creek and the hills and the wide western sky full of stars. And the past was settled, and the future was open, and between them was everything that mattered, and it was good. It was entirely and completely good, and they knew it, and they were grateful for it. And they stood together in the warm dark of the house they had filled with living and looked out at the land that held them, and they were home. Outside, Tanner Creek ran south in the moonlight, as it had run when Thomas Pritchard chose this ground, as it would run when James Thatcher walked this land with his own children, carrying water from the hills to the valley in the particular patient way that water carries itself, finding the way through and going on and going on and going on.